So here's the big idea. Iran has once again launched a direct missile attack against Israel. And this fragile ceasefire in the Middle East is under severe strain. Let's investigate. Welcome to the Dogeared Disciple channel, my friends. I'm David Floyd, and I am, as always, very, very grateful that you're here with me today. Well, on June 7th, 2026, Iran launched another limited ballistic missile attack against northern Israel after Israeli strikes on Hezbollah-linked targets in Beirut, Lebanon. Now, public reporting indicates that Israel intercepted these missiles, or that they fell in open areas with no major damage or confirmed casualties. Now, at least nothing immediately reported. Now, the following morning, on the 8th, today, Israel carried out airstrikes against military targets in western and central Iran, while Iranian state media reported explosions in several cities, including Tehran. Now, those reports show that this fragile ceasefire is more than just under severe strain. It's not settled at all that they're going to return to peace. Now, strategically, the June 7th missile barrage looks a lot less like an attempt at decisive victory, if you will, and it looks much more like calibrated attrition. Iran appears to be probing Israel. They seem to be probing America and the regional states' resolve while trying to preserve enough escalation control. They don't want it to get out of control to avoid a broader confrontation, something that it's not ready to absorb. Now, this fits the larger pattern of missile, drone, proxy, and Strait of Hormuz pressure that has defined the conflict since the U.S.-Israeli opening strikes on February 28th. Now, from a pre-tribulation and dispensational perspective, the developments that we're watching do not, I say again, do not by themselves fulfill Ezekiel 38 and 39. We shouldn't even go there with that. The text describes that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is a land invasion of Israel by a named coalition, followed by unmistakable divine intervention. With that being said, the present crisis that we're watching right now does have some clear prophetic resonance. We're seeing a convergence of events. Now, by that I mean we're seeing that Israel is increasingly being treated as the central burdensome stone of international affairs. Iran is acting like a hostile power in Israel's orbit, and the wider region around Israel is being drawn into clear patterns of alignment, convergence, as I said. We're seeing provocation and pressure against Israel that Bible prophecy students should recognize and watch carefully and soberly. Now, the chief caution here remains pretty essential for us. The Bible calls us as believers to be watchful, to not be date setting. These events may well be birth pang indicators, and I think they are. I think that they're preparatory movements that we're seeing. And we're seeing another stage in this dangerous regional war. So the proper posture for us is readiness without sensationalism, discernment without panicking, and confidence that God remains the sovereign Lord over all nations. So let's look at the current factual situation as we know it right now. The broader conflict that we're seeing began back in February, if you remember, when U.S. and Israeli forces launched a very extensive and damaging strike against Iran, against their military, their missiles, their air defense, nuclear, and their leadership targets. On April 7th and 8th, ceasefire reduced the scale of direct fighting, but it did not resolve the war's underlying cause. So the conflict shifted into a dangerous gray zone. It's less than total war, but far more volatile than peace. Iran has kept pressure on maritime movement through the Straits of Hormuz, at least has attempted to. And U.S. forces remain on high alert, and there are periodic exchanges which continue to test the limits of the ceasefire. Then on June 7th, there was an Iranian missile attack where Iran launched roughly 10 ballistic missiles at northern Israel. In response, they say, to Israeli strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs, which is an area closely associated with Hezbollah. Now, Israel reported that the missiles were intercepted. The missiles sent at them, fired at them by Iran, were intercepted, or they landed in open space. Israel, the sirens were sounding all across northern Israel, but early reporting so far has not confirmed casualties or major damage. The IRGC, of course, has framed this attack as the beginning of a week of continued pressure. This is an announcement designed as much for psychological and political effect as anything else. The strike was limited, but it wasn't trivial. It's marked the first direct, like I said, the first direct Iranian missile attack on Israel since the start of the ceasefire in April. And it has reopened the most dangerous lane of war, which is a direct state-to-state exchange. It has also tied Iran more explicitly to the Lebanon or the Lebanese theater of conflict. And it is indicating clearly that Tehran considers Israeli action against Hezbollah to be part of the same strategic battlefield. It's interesting why Iran now feels so emboldened. Now, Israel's June 8th response to this. As of this recording, early on June 8th, Israel said it struck military targets in western and central Iran in response, in spite of President Trump and the United States administration's demand that they stand down and not attack in response. Well, these attacks, Iranian state media have reported that there are explosions, some significant explosions in Tehran, in Isfahan and Karaj and Tabriz, though immediate details about damage remain at this point, at this hour, unclear. So public reporting has confirmed the closure of airspace around Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport, and separate claims about specific locations such as Mehrabad being attacked should be treated cautiously until they're confirmed by named reporting. We need to confirm these things before we start saying for sure that they've attacked. So the Israeli response has also revealed a diplomatic fracture that has taken place. President Donald Trump had urged Israel not to retaliate immediately, arguing that further escalation could undermine negotiations with Iran. But as we see, nevertheless, Israel proceeded with strikes, signaling that Jerusalem would not subordinate its deterrence calculus entirely to Washington's diplomatic timetable. This is not the first time that Israel has made this statement, and they are unyielding for the most part on this point. They will not subordinate their self-defense, their deterrence, to purely diplomatic attempts by Washington. So let's talk about this, a little bit of strategic analysis. What are we looking at? Okay, so why would Iran do this? What is their motivation? Well, Iran's strategy is rooted in endurance rather than battlefield triumph. Tehran doesn't need to defeat Israel or the United States conventionally in order to achieve the strategic effect that they're going for. And this has been Iran's reported modus operandi for years. This is why they dug tunnels next to the Straits of Hormuz and filled them with missile cities, because it only needs to keep imposing cost. They only need to continue to stretch interceptor inventories and to pressure oil markets and to threaten Gulf partners, to activate proxies and make the political burden of the conflict feel heavier and heavier with time against its enemies. So this is this is the logic of what's called an asymmetric attrition strategy. They're using drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, naval harassment when they dare, proxy fire, and selective attacks on regional infrastructure, that lets, in their mind, in their strategy, it lets Iran widen the theater without even matching or trying to match U.S. or Israeli air power directly. Well, obviously, such tools that they're using are much cheaper to employ than the defensive systems required to defeat them. So they create a constant problem of readiness for the United States and Israel and other allied governments. So in this context, the June 7th attack is illustrative of this doctrine in miniature. A volley of approximately 10 missiles wasn't designed to conquer territory or destroy Israel's war-making capacity. It was designed to communicate, in their minds, resolve, and to punish Israel for actions in Lebanon, an attempt to rally Iran's axis and remind Washington that the war can widen whenever Tehran chooses. Now, this is Iran's point of view on this. Now, many casual observers may look at that and say Iran's crazy. The only side that is showing restraint is the side of their enemy. So, if Tehran chooses to go down this road, thinking that restraint was part of the message, all along, while Iran wanted escalation, but they didn't want uncontrolled escalation. So, without any surprise, U.S. officials have rejected the premise that Iran can outlast American power. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth publicly declared back in March that Iran could not outlast the United States and that the American offensive and defensive capabilities would set the pace of the conflict. So we have continued skirmishes, supposedly pressures on munition stocks, and the strain placed on U.S. forces. If you believe that, you can understand why Iran thinks they see endurance as a weapon. So, Iran could still be dangerous to an extent, but, we have to ask ourselves, are they really sure that they want to go down this road? Are they delusional? How long can they keep this kind of thing up? So they think they can keep the region suspended, is what I'm saying. They want to try to keep the region suspended between war and ceasefire. And frankly, if you just examine the last 4.5 decades of Iranian behavior, what we're seeing now in the case of terrorism and such, it's an improvement. I'm not sure the Iranian leadership really understands the problem that they're facing. Maybe they're just putting a brave face on. I don't know. But I do know and understand what their thinking is as far as their attrition strategy. Now, as far as I can see, the prophetic implications here essentially we're seeing more alignment, but not fulfillment. Now, Ezekiel 38 and 39 it still remains one of the key prophetic passages to watch in relationship to Israel's latter-day security crisis. And we know the prophecy describes a coalition coming against the land of Israel. It culminates not in Israeli military brilliance or diplomatic rescue, but in God's unmistakable intervention on Israel's behalf. The Lord declares his holiness before the nations and makes his name known through judgment. However, interpretive restraint here is necessary because a missile attack from Iran is not the full Ezekiel 38 invasion. The Bible presents a ground invasion by a much bigger coalition. And it's often understood by pre-trib teachers to involve powers associated with modern Russia, Iran, Turkey, and other surrounding regions. So these current events that we're watching may be preparatory. They're certainly illustrative. They're illustrating the concept. And we could even be seeing some foreshadowing. But they shouldn't really be labeled as complete fulfillment until the biblical details are actually present. So Iran's presence in the prophetic conversation that we're discussing is significant, as we've said before, because Ezekiel 38 explicitly names Persia or modern Iran among the hostile powers. Modern Iran or modern Persia's presence and ideological opposition to Israel, with its missiles and drone capabilities, its cultivation of proxy forces in Lebanon, in Yemen, Iraq, and elsewhere, they're creating what we could call a contemporary framework that many prophecy students should naturally, of course, watch very closely. It's like the parts are all coming together, very slowly in cases, quicker in others. But the danger here isn't just Iran's missiles. It's the convergence of ideology, the convergence of military reach, the convergence of regional alignment that's taking place. And in that sense, the June 7th flare-up, the June 7th attack, frankly, it looks like another tremor in a much larger prophetic landscape that we're watching. So Iran is not isolated, and that's important to understand. Iran operates through networks, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militia, pressure points in the Gulf, all allow Tehran, in their own thinking at least, to challenge Israel and the West through multiple fronts. They have been greatly weakened, however. They were greatly weakened by the initial attack. They were greatly weakened by the United States going into Venezuela. They're greatly weakened by Cuba being basically being taken care of as well by the United States. But Iran is still a threat. At least that is what they're trying to push out. I think they're hoping that this will escalate to where Turkey and Russia will step in, and possibly China. And it is interesting to note the much more demure nature of President Trump's efforts since returning from China. I wonder what happened there. Something to pray about and think about. Maybe try to do a little investigating to see what's up there. But again, Iran is not isolated in that sense. It's still part of a much diminished network, but there is still a network. Now, that pattern that we're watching resembles this kind of multi-actor hostility towards Israel that the Bible repeatedly places in the foreground of end-time conflict. Israel is being put in the middle, and everyone is pointing at them and blaming them for all the troubles that the world is having. And it's only going to increase. Now, Zechariah 12 and the burdensome stone, and that's what we're talking about. Zechariah 12, 2-3 describes Jerusalem as a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone for the nations. Now, while that passage should not be used carelessly as a headline for every crisis. The broad pattern is striking. Israel remains the small nation around which enormous international tensions gather. All these diplomatic capitals, oil markets, military planners, regional proxies, global media, all drawn again and again and again to the same pressure point: the land, the people, the security of Israel. So Jesus spoke of wars. He spoke of rumors of wars, birth pangs, but he also warned against panic and premature conclusions. Matthew 24:36 forbids date setting. So an accurate pre-tribulation view here should produce vigilance, but not hysteria. The church is called to look for Christ, to preach the gospel, to comfort one another with the blessed hope, and to discern the times without pretending to know what God has not revealed. Now, these events may very well be birth pang dynamics, and I believe they are. They also may be part of a long chain of regional conflict that God uses to arrange the chessboard of the nations. Either way, our proper response isn't fear, it's readiness, it's prayerfulness, it's biblical clarity, it's biblical literacy. It's a renewed urgency to proclaim the gospel while the door to do so remains open. So, implications and outlook. So in the short term, at least in my opinion, the likelihood of further probing by Iran and response by Israel is quite high. Iran has threatened sustained strikes. Israel has already shown willingness to respond directly. And Hezbollah-linked dynamics in Lebanon remain tightly connected to this broader Iran-Israel confrontation. So any miscalculation here, it's going to rupture the ceasefire more completely, and it's going to pull other regional proxies into the fight. Again, stage setting. Economically, we can expect that the Strait of Hormuz will continue to be a sore spot. It's going to continue to be one of the conflict's most consequential pressure points. And even limited disruption can unsettle oil markets for some. And shipping routes and insurance costs and consumer prices, all of these things can inflict some damage. Now that gives, it seems, Iran leverage beyond battlefield, and it may help to explain why Tehran continues to treat maritime pressure as a strategic instrument. I kind of think at this point it's a bit delusional on their part to think that that they have any real pressure or any real juice, for lack of a better term, when it comes to Hormuz. Iran, in my opinion, is riding a razor's edge, and it could go either way depending on what they want to do. So between the Twelver mentality of the mullahs and the suicidal tendencies of the IRGC, it's really going to be very interesting over the next few weeks. We need to keep our eyes open and watching. So, and on top of all this, of course, is the diplomacy problem with Washington trying to preserve a negotiating path while restraining both Iran and Israel from widening the war. You know, I've been watching this for over 50 years. This is an old tune. Shades of Henry Kissinger here. The task is becoming much more difficult. And Washington is, I'm afraid, they're about to find out what it means in Zechariah, where it talks about the burdensome stone. So Israel's June 8th response, it really does indicate that when Israel sees deterrence at stake, It's going to act, no matter who tells them to sit down. So Iran, in the meantime, appears to believe that pressure and endurance can force concession. And I think that Iran's delusional when it comes to this. So prophetically, watchers should monitor for developments, in my opinion. We should be monitoring a broader anti-Israel coalition forming. We should be watching for much deeper and apparent Russian or Turkish or both involvement in this situation. We should be watching for a shift from missile exchange to land invasion logic. And any event that leaves Israel in a position where only divine intervention can explain its deliverance. I think that is on the horizon. And until then, I think it's best to describe the present crisis as alignment pressure and not fulfillment. So let's take the most responsible posture. Let's be steady, informed, unsensational. Let's watch U.S.-Iran talks, Israeli operations in Lebanon and Iran, Hezbollah's response pattern, the Hormuz situation, and Russian and Turkish positioning in the very near future. And let's watch the rhetoric of regional powers towards Israel. But let's keep every headline subordinate to Scripture. The news can illustrate prophetic patterns, but Scripture must govern prophetic interpretation. So for us believers, the application is clear. We shouldn't sleepwalk through the times we're living in, and we shouldn't panic as though the Lord has lost control. Remember, the church is not appointed to wrath. Christ remains the blessed hope. And the nearness of world-shaking events should press us towards holiness and prayer and gospel urgency and confidence in our sovereign God, who declares the end from the beginning. Well, friends, until next time, I pray that God richly blesses you.